Hello, you guys, and welcome back to the Sweat Simple podcast. I am so excited about today's topic because it's something I get a lot of questions on, and it's something that's pretty trendy in the health and fitness space right now. And we are going to be talking about all about cycle syncing. Part of the reason that sparked this podcast episode for me is the other day I was actually listening to one of my favorite podcasts. It's not health and fitness related. It's basically just a lifestyle chit-chatting type podcast. And the hosts were talking about cycle syncing and how they needed to start doing it in order to regulate their hormones and get their bodies to properly respond to exercise. And sometimes as a health and fitness coach, these conversations can be frustrated to listen to because I know these ladies have a large platform and they don't really understand what they're fully doing, but what they were explaining is not actually necessary and wasn't really backed by the research and the science to support this idea of cycle syncing. And what happens is this is really how these trends catch on. Someone with a pretty large platform shares something that worked for them, and maybe they have a body type that you really envy, or you trust them because you're listening to their content for a reason, you like them. And then you start to get it in your head that this is something that you should be doing, and maybe this is something that you should try. And if it worked for them, why would it not work for you? And I get that, and I understand where this trend is coming from. Cycle syncing isn't really as impactful as people are leading it to believe. And again, I get where this trend pops up because people really like to make fitness as complicated as possible. Because if it were truly as basic and simple as it really is, you feel like you should have already reached your goals, right? It cannot possibly be this simple. You cannot possibly just focus on these small things, because if it was that easy, there would be no reason for you to have not reached your goals already. But something I always say is that yes, just because this is simple doesn't always mean that it's easy. And a lot of the times, instead of actually focusing on the basics and making these lifestyle adjustments around, our eating habits, your sleep, your stress, it feels easier to jump on the latest trend. It feels easier to just do this giant switch that you've heard has worked for other people, instead of really trying to make those long-lasting lifestyle changes. But not only is cycle syncing not necessary, it's also probably having the opposite effect of what you want and making it harder to reach your goals. But at the end of the day, I am not a fitness coach who believes in a one-size-fits-all process. I like to tell my clients, you are the boss of your own life, and I always want you doing what is best for you and your body. So during this podcast, I'm not here to tell you not to do cycle syncing. What I am here to do, not only in this episode, but as a coach and throughout this podcast in general, is I don't want to just tell you exactly what to do. I don't want to tell you what the best approach is. What I want to do is give you all of the information, give you all of the research that either supports or doesn't support a lot of these fitness trends that are happening and a lot of this conflicting information in the industry, so that you can make the decision that's right for you, your body, and your goals. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here to give you the education and the tools so that you can start to make these decisions for yourself. I want you to feel really empowered in that. So we're going to get into it and talk all about cycle syncing and what the deal really is. So let's just start with the basics. Some of you might not even be familiar. If you're not deep in TikTok or Instagram, you might not even know what the heck cycle syncing really is. But at its core, the idea of cycle syncing is actually cycling your workouts around your menstrual cycle. So the thought is that by matching your exercise routine to your hormonal fluctuations, you can optimize your training and get better results. Now, before we dive into if cycle syncing is necessary, the really nitty gritty of it, let's just cover some basic education about the menstrual cycle and how it might be impacting your overall energy levels, workouts, and nutrition needs. Because I don't know about you guys, I feel like this is something that I was not really taught in school, and you don't always understand what's happening in your body during this menstrual cycle and during these phases. Now, I also will say, if you are on a hormonal birth control, your menstrual cycle and your hormones are not going to necessarily follow this same cycle. Most hormonal birth control is providing you with synthetic hormones basically, so your body isn't naturally going to have these like rises and falls. So this is a lot of times why people with birth control like that tend to feel like their periods aren't as intense and they aren't really fully going through these phases. But if you're experiencing a pretty average normal menstrual cycle, you're going to go through 4 phases. So the follicular phase is typically the first 2 weeks of your menstrual cycle. And the menstrual cycle actually occurs during this phase, happening on day 1 through day 7 of your cycle. Now, during this phase, estrogen is rising and progesterone remains low but steady. Now, when estrogen is elevated and dominating over progesterone, this is a prime time to build muscle and burn some fat, which is why many people recommend strength training during the follicular phase. Now, during this phase, women tend to be able to train harder, eat a bit more due to the insulin sensitivity effects of estrogen, and not have as much stress due to the elevated levels of estrogen. So hunger levels are also typically lower. Then the egg is released, which actually signals the start of the next phase of your menstrual cycle, which is ovulation. And during an average cycle, this typically happens around day 14. Now, hormone levels are at their peak here, which can result in high energy. Now, after ovulation, you move into the final stage of your menstrual cycle, and I feel like this is the one that people are really going in on hard. It is the luteal phase. Now, during this phase, progesterone begins to like steadily rise. Estrogen levels also remain high, but progesterone is slightly higher. Now, this does the opposite of what estrogen does. When progesterone is around, women are a little bit more insulin resistant and are more stress reactive, which is why a lot of, hormone gurus and influencers suggest only doing low impact exercise during the luteal phase. This is also where you're going to experience symptoms of PMS, just as a result of the hormone levels dropping. Now that we've got that basic education about your menstrual cycle, let's talk about if you should actually be cycling your workouts to your period. Now, a lot of people right now are quick to say that your workout program needs to match these rising and falling hormone levels. You should only be strength training during the follicular phase, and during the luteal phase, you want to limit yourself to low impact exercise like walking, Pilates. And fitness influencers often claim that this is how you get the most optimal results. You're working with your hormones, you're keeping your hormones balanced, but research suggests that this isn't really the best option, and for a couple of different reasons. The first reason is that in general, results have been inconsistent across research studies and really show no clear indication that any changes should even be made based on your menstrual cycle. There was a new systematic review that pointed to really no impact on strength-related outcomes due to the menstrual cycle, or such small differences that it was likely not to make a significant impact on your training. So because of this, a conclusion really can't be made that fluctuating hormone levels and your menstrual cycle have an impact on strength-related outcome. Research is also still inconclusive as to whether hormones fluctuate enough within the cycle to really have any output or difference on resistance training. The next point is that the benefits of following a strength training program uninterrupted far outweigh only strength training a few weeks a month. There's a lot that we're still trying to understand about these hormone fluctuations and how they impact our strength, like I said, but something we do know for sure is that strength training consistently is extremely beneficial to your overall health, especially things like building muscle and improving your bone density. So it's kind of confusing that when you look at the exercise recommendations for cycle syncing and each period phase, a lot of people are suggesting that during your menstrual phase, you're just doing like yoga, some walking, taking full rest. During the follicular phase, you're running, cycling, strength training. It's a little bit more intense. During the ovulation phase, you are like hitting things hard. You're doing hits, you're doing heavy strength training. And then during the luteal phase, you're just, again, doing things like light walking and Pilates. Now, what that means is that only about 2 weeks of strength training per month, which is just not ideal. And we know that from the research. It becomes really difficult to build muscle and gain strength if you're taking a few weeks off from lifting weights every month. You likely won't be receiving adequate training volume to each muscle group to really stimulate any sort of muscle growth. We know that the best way to build muscle and to gain strength is to follow a strength training program that applies the principle of progressive overload, aka the program gets more difficult as time goes on by adding things like weights, sets, reps, or some other sort of stimulus. It's difficult to apply progressive overload if you're taking a few weeks off from strength training every month. And while adjustments during your period may be helpful, which we will get to later on in this podcast, taking weeks off and completely adjusting your training cycle is actually going to harm your strength gains more than it will help. The third, and in my opinion, the most important point, is that menstrual cycles aren't created equal, and adjusting your training to fit your menstrual cycle is assuming like regulation in your cycle, which is typically not the case. I'm sure you know, as a woman, some periods you're having like more intense symptoms of PMS and more intense symptoms in general. Other periods are a lot lighter and not as impactful in terms of like day-to-day activity and energy and hunger levels. And that is the most important piece. Not every woman has a 28-day cycle, and even cycles within the same woman can vary. And this is why research surrounding how your menstrual cycle impacts training can be really difficult, because unless you're monitoring your body temperature and your hormone levels on a daily basis, which would be really crazy and hard for you to keep up with on your own, you'd like basically need to be in a lab in order to do this. It's difficult to know with 100% certainty which days you're actually in each menstrual phase. So because of this, you're changing your training style based on assumptions and best guesses rather than fact about where your hormones actually are in general. And changing your training style based on best guesses and assumptions when you might not even be in a certain phase of your menstrual cycle and your hormones might not have even changed, it's not the best strategy. Not to mention, not every woman experiences that same level of intensity and symptoms when it comes to their cycles. You could be someone who experiences like very minimal or no changes to your energy levels and training output during your different menstrual phases, and adjusting your training schedule to account for changes that might not even happen is leaving a lot of strength and muscle gain opportunities on the table. Now, because of all of the above, I personally, as a coach, can't say in support of the research that you should cycle your workouts to your period. But again, if this is something that you think is going to work for you or you want to try it, go ahead. I'm just here to say, like, the research doesn't support this right now. What do I recommend though as a coach? What could you do instead of syncing your workouts to your menstrual cycle? Because ultimately, there often are changes happening in your body, and that can lead to a need to change your training schedule. But instead of cycle syncing, instead of completely adjusting your workouts to the type of phase you're in, what I recommend is to adjust your workouts as needed, adjust your nutrition as needed, and listen to your body. A blanket suggestion of completely changing your training style every few weeks isn't probably going to be very smart, and it's not going to get you very far. But since we're all unique and we all have different symptoms, our cycles are all different, it can be smart to identify what you personally need during each phase of your cycle. As a coach, I have worked with a lot of women, hundreds of women, and I can say firsthand that everyone's menstrual cycle is a little unique. So for most of my online coaching clients, honestly, they require no adjustments to their training or nutrition during their cycle. Women, you are freaking resilient. You are freaking strong. And I don't know why there's like this trend on the internet that wants us to believe that like we're these like fragile little snowflakes and like we shouldn't be lifting heavy weights very often and we're getting all this inflammation and everything is bad for our hormones. And at the end of the day, our bodies are actually very resilient. And like I said, for many of my coaching clients, they don't need any adjustments to their training or nutrition during their cycle. For some of my clients, though, we do need to adjust training volume down a little bit during their period. Sometimes we even need to bump calories up, especially if they're having like a really hungry period this cycle. But at the end of the day, it's not every single month. For other clients, like I said, I bump calories up slightly during the week of their period or during the week that they're PMSing if they have a lot of increased hunger. But this is so individual, depending on the woman, depending on the time of the month, and depending on that unique cycle. As I'm sure you've realized, there are a lot of lifestyle factors that can impact the intensity of your period symptoms. And if your stress, your sleep, and your nutrition are in a good spot, you likely won't have to make these big adjustments to your training. And that's actually why many of my clients don't even need to make adjustments. Really intense, painful periods have become normalized, but really, like, that's not normal. If your period or if your hormones are in a good spot and well regulated, your period shouldn't be that intense. Of course, this is not accounting for things like PCOS or endometriosis or another hormone condition, but in general, your body is not in as much flux and you are not as fragile as a lot of the internet is trying to lead you to believe. You can handle more intense workouts through your menstrual cycle. Now, this is where utilizing an RPE scale during your training can be really helpful. So if you don't know, RPE is rate of perceived exertion, and it basically allows you to indicate how hard you're working in the workout. So during low energy periods of your cycle, an 8 RPE, typically the scale is 0 through 10. So 8 would be, almost fully max effort. An 8 RPE could be achieved with lower weight than later on in your cycle. So use the RPE scale to adjust your training as needed and account for those monthly changes rather than just throwing strength training out the window for a few weeks each month. So real life example, let's say that you're in your period week and you're really low energy and all the weight just feels really heavy. Maybe you're typically bench pressing like 50 pounds and the weight moves really easily and it's, super easy for you. During that week, you might feel that same amount of effort with using 40 pounds. And that's okay. Those are the types of adjustments that are good and okay to make. Listening to your body, listening to how the weight feels, listening to how much energy you have when you show up for every training session, rather than just automatically assuming you're going to be really low energy and you shouldn't do any strength training that week. Now, if you're feeling lower energy during your period, like I said, it might be helpful to use lighter weight, not really push RPE, but you could also adjust your nutrition and calories to better account for increased cravings and energy needs. So rather than cycle syncing, I truly recommend staying the course and focusing on just being really consistent. If changes need to be made in the future or month to month, make them, but there is no need for blanket changes or to completely ditch your strength training for an entire month. I hope at this point you are feeling empowered to make the decision for yourself about whether cycle syncing is necessary and, most importantly, if it's the best route for you. If you found this episode helpful, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing with a friend. These actions help a ton when it comes to growing this community. I also know how confusing this topic is, so if you have any questions, please feel free to shoot me a DM. I would love to chat through it with you further and even discuss individually if you think cycle syncing is the best option for you. So thank you guys so much for listening. I hope you have a great rest of your week, and I'll talk to you soon.